They called him the Beast of Blackwood Creek. 7 mail-order brides took one look at Brucey Abernathy's scarred face and the desolate Montana peaks he called home, and ran. The mountain man was cursed to die alone. Then, the stagecoach brought Josephine Caldwell. She was 60, and she wasn't running. By the winter of 1886, the town of Blackwood Creek, Montana Territory, had turned Brucey Abernathy into a ghost story to frighten unruly children. Brucey lived high up on the jagged spine of the Bitterroot Range, in a cabin he'd felled and notched with his own hands. He was a mountain of a man, standing 6'4", with a thick beard woven with premature silver and a jagged, pale scar that pulled down the corner of his left eye, a parting gift from a territorial grizzly a decade prior. But it wasn't just his size or the scar that terrified the townsfolk. It was the fierce, impenetrable silence of the man. Brucey only came down from the mountain twice a year to trade furs for coffee, flour, and bullets. He spoke to no one, paid in gold dust, and vanished back into the timberline before the sun set. Yet, beneath the gruff exterior, a crushing loneliness had gnawed at Brucey. 2 years ago, in a moment of desperate vulnerability fueled by the howling winter winds, he had paid a handsome fee to a matrimonial agency in St. Louis. He wanted a wife. He wanted a hearth that felt like a home, and a voice to break the deafening silence of the pines. The agency delivered, but the harsh reality of the mountain quickly dismantled any romantic pioneer dreams. The first bride, Clara Higgins, lasted exactly 3 days. She took one look at Brucey gutting a freshly hunted elk on the front porch, her hands trembling so hard she dropped her carpetbag and demanded to be taken back to town. The fourth bride, Mary Beth, fled in the dead of night. The incessant howling of the timber wolves and the oppressive isolation broke her spirit. Brucey had found her wandering half-frozen on the trail the next morning, and silently carried her to the stagecoach depot himself. The seventh bride, Florence Meade, was the final straw. She had lasted a week. She was a pretty young thing who tried to tidy the cabin, but she made the mistake of trying to pry open a heavy, iron-banded chest tucked beneath Brucey's cot. When Brucey caught her, he had slammed his fist against the wall, his voice booming like thunder, ordering her to never touch it. Terrified by his sudden eruption, she rode a pack mule down the mountain the very next morning, spreading tales to the town that Brucey Abernathy was a violent madman hiding stolen gold or perhaps dead bodies in his cabin. What Florence and the other 6 brides didn't know, what Brucey refused to tell them, was that he wanted them to run. The truth was far more dangerous than a mountain man's temper. Brucey's cabin sat directly atop the only viable pass through the Blackwood Range. A ruthless cattle baron named Jack Montgomery had recently realized that controlling Abernathy Pass meant controlling the beef supply line to the booming silver mines in Idaho. Montgomery had sent his men to buy Brucey out. When Brucey refused, Montgomery resorted to threats and then to violence. Brucey's sudden, booming temper with Florence wasn't born of malice. It was born of terror. He had seen Montgomery's scouts lurking in the tree line that afternoon. He realized that bringing a young, naive bride to the mountain hadn't brought him companionship. It had brought him a hostage. He had to make her leave. He had to scare them off to protect them. After Florence fled, Brucey sent a final, bitter letter to the agency in St. Louis. Send no more. The mountain is no place for a woman. Keep the remaining funds. He resigned himself to dying alone, guarding his pass, and fighting Montgomery's men until the bitter end. He locked the heavy iron-banded chest which held not gold, but the legal deeds to the mountain, signed by the governor himself, and prepared for a solitary war. Then came the second Tuesday of November. The stagecoach rattled into Blackwood Creek through a veil of freezing rain. The townsfolk huddled under the awnings of the general store, watching the coach pull up to the muddy depot. Sheriff Thomas Harding, a man whose badge was secretly paid for by Montgomery's cattle money, leaned against a post, chewing a matchstick. The stagecoach door swung open. No young, teary-eyed girl stepped out this time. Instead, a heavy black leather boot planted itself firmly in the Montana mud. Out stepped Josephine Caldwell. Josie was 60 years old. She wore a sensible, heavy wool coat, a simple gray bonnet, and carried a wooden trunk that looked as battered as she felt. Her hair was a striking, coarse silver, pulled into a severe bun. Her face was etched with the deep lines of a woman who had survived a lifetime of hard truths. She had buried a husband after the Battle of Antietam, raised 3 sons who had all gone off to pan for gold in California and forgotten her, and spent 30 years as a seamstress in a suffocating Boston boarding house. When the matrimonial agency in St. Louis received Brucey's final bitter letter, the clerk had been about to throw it away. Josie, who had walked into the agency that very morning looking for any ticket out of her miserable city life, saw the letter on the desk. She read between the lines of the gruff mountain man's scrawl. She didn't see a monster. She saw a man holding a fortress. "I'll go to him," she had told the shocked clerk. Now, standing in the freezing rain of Blackwood Creek, Josie adjusted her grip on her trunk. Sheriff Harding pushed himself off the post, a cruel smirk on his face. "You lost, ma'am? The knitting circle is back in St. Louis. If you're here for Brucey Abernathy, you might want to buy a return ticket. The beast on the mountain eats little old ladies for breakfast." Josie turned her sharp, slate-gray eyes onto the sheriff. She didn't flinch. "I've survived a war, a cholera outbreak, and 3 teenage boys, Sheriff. A man in the woods doesn't frighten me. Now, which way is the mountain?" It took Josie 2 days to make the trek up the steep, winding trail. She rented a sturdy draft horse, ignoring the townsfolk who took bets on how many hours she would last. When she finally reached the clearing, the sheer brutality of the landscape took her breath away. The cabin was a fortress of raw timber, backed against a sheer cliff, overlooking a dizzying drop into the valley. Brucey was chopping wood in the yard. His massive axe came down, splitting a thick pine log in 2 with a deafening crack. He stopped. He felt eyes on him. Slowly, he turned, his hand instinctively dropping to the Colt revolver holstered at his hip. He stared at the older woman sitting atop the draft horse. He blinked, the scarred side of his face twitching. "Agency must have lost their minds," Brucey rumbled, his voice like grinding stones. It was the first time he had spoken aloud in months. "Or you're lost, grandmother. The town is 10 miles back down the ridge." Josie calmly dismounted. She tied the horse to the hitching post, patted its neck, and walked straight toward the giant of a man. She stopped 3 feet from him, looking up, entirely unfazed by his imposing height or the terrifying scar on his face. "My name is Josephine Caldwell," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I saw your letter. I paid my own way here. I am not looking for a prince, Mr. Abernathy, and I imagine you are not looking for a princess. I am looking for a quiet place to live out my years, and I am willing to work for my keep." Brucey stared down at her, dumbfounded. "I canceled the contract. I ain't looking for a wife no more. It ain't safe up here." "Because of the wolves?" Josie asked, arching a silver eyebrow. "Because of the winter," Brucey lied, gripping his axe handle tighter. "I brought a heavy coat," Josie countered. She looked past him, her eyes sweeping the tree line. Then, she looked at the cabin. "Your roof is missing 3 shingles on the west side. Your woodpile is improperly stacked for a deep freeze, and you look like you haven't eaten a hot meal that didn't come out of a frying pan in a decade. I'm staying." Brucey's jaw tightened. "I will not protect you when you realize you've made a mistake. I'll give you 1 night's rest. Tomorrow, you ride back down." "We'll see," Josie said. She pushed past him, grabbed the handle of her heavy trunk, and began dragging it toward the cabin door. That evening, the tension in the small cabin was thick enough to cut with a hunting knife. Brucey sat in his corner, whittling a piece of cedar, watching Josie with narrow, untrusting eyes. He expected her to jump at the sound of the wind. He expected her to complain about the hard wooden chair. Instead, Josie had quietly swept the floor, taken inventory of his meager pantry, and baked a simple, savory loaf of cornmeal bread. She set a steaming plate in front of him without a word, then sat at the opposite end of the table to eat her own. As the night deepened, the wind began to howl, battering against the cabin walls. Brucey waited for the inevitable panic. Bride number 4 had broken down in tears at this exact sound. Josie just sipped her tea. "Wind sounds like an angry train," she remarked casually. Brucey grunted. Then, over the sound of the wind, a different noise echoed through the mountain. It was a sharp, distinct crack. A rifle shot. It echoed from the valley below, dangerously close to the lower ridge of Brucey's property. Brucey was on his feet in a microsecond. The whittling knife clattered to the floor. He blew out the oil lamp, plunging the cabin into absolute darkness. "Get under the table," Brucey hissed in the dark, the terrifying booming voice returning. "Don't make a sound. Don't move." He grabbed his Winchester rifle from the wall mount, expecting the woman to be weeping or screaming in terror. But as Brucey crouched by the window, peering into the moonlit snow, he felt a calm presence beside him. Josie was standing right next to him in the dark. In her hands, she held the heavy cast-iron skillet she had just used to bake the bread. Her breathing was perfectly even. "Who is shooting at us, Brucey?" she asked quietly. "And please don't insult my intelligence by telling me wolves have learned to use firearms." Brucey looked at the 60-year-old woman in the dark. She wasn't trembling. Her grip on the skillet was white-knuckled, but her eyes were locked onto the tree line, calculating, alert. For the first time in years, the mountain man felt something other than cold isolation and crushing responsibility. He felt shock, and slowly, a grim respect began to take root in his chest. "Men who want this land," Brucey whispered back, realizing the act was over. "And they don't leave witnesses." Josie just nodded, tightening her grip on the iron skillet. "Well then, we'd better make sure they don't get through the front door." The first bullet shattered the single pane of glass in the front window, burying itself deep into the heavy oak of the dining table where Brucey and Josie had sat only moments before. The frigid November wind immediately howled through the breach, carrying with it the sharp, sulfuric scent of burnt powder. "Stay low," Brucey roared over the wind, racking the lever of his Winchester. He kicked out the remaining shards of glass with the heel of his boot and fired twice into the darkness. A yelp of pain echoed from the tree line, followed by the crunch of heavy boots retreating in the snow. Josie didn't scream. She crawled methodically across the floorboards, her heavy wool skirt catching on splinters, until she reached the corner where Brucey kept his ammunition. She dragged the heavy canvas sack toward him, keeping her head well beneath the windowsill. "How many?" she asked, her voice tight but remarkably steady. "3, maybe 4, Brucey grunted, his eyes narrowed as he scanned the moonlit snowdrifts. "Jack Montgomery's hired guns. They've been testing my perimeter for weeks. Florence leaving must have signaled to them that I was alone again. They think I'm an easy target without collateral damage to worry about." "Well," Josie said, methodically lining up brass cartridges on a low stool beside him for easy access. "They are poorly informed." Another volley of gunfire erupted. Lead chewed through the thick pine logs of the cabin's exterior. One bullet found a gap in the chinking, whizzing past Josie's ear and embedding itself in a sack of flour. A white cloud plumed into the dark room. "Montgomery wants the deed to the pass," Brucey explained, firing another suppressing shot. "He controls the beef, but he needs this route to move it to the Idaho silver camps before the deep freeze. I own the land. Signed by the territorial governor. As long as I'm breathing, he has to go the long way around. And it's costing him thousands." "And if you aren't breathing?" Josie asked, wiping flour from her cheek. "Then the land goes to the county, and Sheriff Harding signs it over to Montgomery by Tuesday," Brucey growled. Suddenly, a heavy thud echoed from the roof. Brucey swore violently. "They're trying to flank us. They've got a man on the ridge behind the cabin." Before Brucey could reposition, a deafening blast tore through the heavy wooden back door. The iron hinges screamed as the wood splintered. A man cloaked in a heavy buffalo coat kicked his way into the kitchen, a double-barreled shotgun raised. It was Deacon Rollins, Montgomery's chief enforcer, a man known for leaving no survivors. Brucey spun around, raising his Winchester, but the angle was wrong. Rollins had the drop on him. But Rollins hadn't factored in the 60-year-old seamstress hiding in the shadows of the pantry. Josie didn't have a gun. What she had was the massive cast-iron kettle she had left simmering on the wood stove to boil down fat for soap. With a surge of adrenaline that defied her age, she grabbed the heavy iron handle with an oven mitt, stepped out of the shadows, and hurled the boiling, caustic slurry directly at Rollins. The enforcer shrieked as the boiling fat hit his coat and face. He dropped the shotgun, his hands flying to his eyes in agony, stumbling backward out the shattered doorway into the snow. "Get the door!" Bruce yelled, firing a shot over Rollins's head to keep the other men back. Josie grabbed a heavy oak plank they used for barring the door and slammed it into the iron brackets, sealing the breach. She was breathing hard, leaning against the wood, her hands finally beginning to shake. Brucey looked at her, his chest heaving. The moonlight catching the scarred side of his face made him look wild, dangerous, and completely in awe. "You just took down Deacon Rollins with a soup kettle." "It was soap," Josie corrected, her voice trembling slightly. She looked down at her hands. "And my best kettle." The gunfire from outside suddenly ceased. The sudden silence was more terrifying than the noise. Brucey moved to the window, peering out cautiously. "They're falling back. Rollins is screaming loud enough to wake the dead." They didn't expect a two-front war. But as Brucey turned back to the room, his leg buckled. He crashed to his knees, his hand clutching his right thigh. Blood, thick and dark, was seeping rapidly through his denim trousers. A ricochet from the back door blast had caught him. "Brucey!" Josie rushed to his side, tearing off her heavy wool coat to press it against the wound. "It's deep," Brucey rasped, his face going pale. "If I bleed out, Josie, under the floorboards by the hearth. The iron chest. It has the deed and a pouch of gold dust. You take it. You take the horse at first light and you ride for Helena. Don't go to Blackwood Creek. Harding will kill you." Josie looked at the massive man bleeding on her floor. She remembered the 6 brides who had run away. She remembered a lifetime of men telling her what to do, from her late husband to the factory bosses in Boston. "I am not going to Helena Brucey Abernathy," she said fiercely, ripping the hem of her petticoat to create a makeshift tourniquet. "And you are not going to die. I didn't travel halfway across the country to become a widow twice." For 3 agonizing days, the blizzard effectively sealed the mountain pass, trapping Josie and the bleeding giant inside the freezing cabin. The isolation was absolute, but Josephine Caldwell had not survived the typhoid outbreaks of Boston or the crushing grief of losing a husband to the musket fire of Antietam by panicking in the dark. She became a woman possessed by a cold, methodical fury to keep Brucey Abernathy alive. The ricochet had torn a jagged, ugly path through Brucey's heavy thigh. As he drifted into a feverish delirium, Josie laid him flat on the heavy oak dining table. She didn't have ether or whiskey. She only had boiling water, a sterilized sewing needle, and a small, sharp paring knife. "Hold on to the chair leg, Brucey," she commanded, her voice betraying none of the terror fluttering in her chest. "This is going to burn." She dug the jagged lead fragment out of his flesh, ignoring the way his massive frame convulsed and his deep, animalistic groans echoed against the pine walls. When the bullet finally clattered into a tin basin, she heated the flat blade of his hunting knife directly in the hearth's coals until it glowed a furious cherry red. She pressed it to the wound to cauterize the bleeding. Brucey roared, a sound that rivaled the Timberwolves, before his eyes rolled back and he passed out from the pain. Through the long, terrible nights that followed, Josie sat vigil. She bathed his face with snowmelt and fed him a bitter tea brewed from willow bark to break the fever. In his delirium, the beast of Blackwood Creek finally let his guard down. He muttered about a man named Jeremiah, his brother-in-arms who had died in his arms at the Battle of Shiloh, making Brucey promise to find a quiet piece of the world where the madness of men couldn't reach them. He had bought this mountain to honor a ghost, only to find that the greed of men extended even into the clouds. By the dawn of the 4th day, the wind finally died. The sky broke into a piercing, crystalline blue, reflecting off waist-deep snowdrifts. The brutal cold remained, but the storm had passed. Brucey awoke with a gasp, his chest heaving. His fever had broken, leaving him pale and incredibly weak. He looked around the cabin, his eyes finally landing on Josie, who was asleep in a wooden chair, her head resting on her arms near his feet. "Josie," he rasped, his voice rough as sandpaper. She bolted upright, her slate-gray eyes instantly alert. She moved to him, pressing a cool, wet cloth to his forehead. "You're back with the living, Mr. Abernathy. Montgomery will know the storm is over." Brucey breathed heavily, trying to push himself up on his elbows, only to collapse back with a wince. "He'll send a dozen men today. Deacon Rollins was just the scout." Brucey pointed a shaking, calloused finger toward the hearth. "Under the floorboards, the iron chest." "Get it." Josie didn't argue. She pried up the loose plank and hauled the heavy iron-banded chest onto the floor. Unlocking it with a brass key Brucey wore around his neck, she expected to find a fortune in gold. Instead, there was only a small leather pouch of dust and a thick, wax-sealed parchment. "Take the horse," Brucey ordered, his voice laced with desperate finality. "Take the gold. Ride down the east slope, away from the town. You can make it to the rail station in Helena by tomorrow night. Forget you ever saw me." Josie ignored the gold. Instead, she broke the wax seal on the parchment and unrolled the heavy paper. It was the original deed to the mountain, signed by the territorial governor in 1878. "I am a seamstress, Brucey," Josie said calmly, her eyes scanning the dense, archaic legal text. "But my late husband, Nathaniel, was a circuit judge in Massachusetts. I spent 20 years typing his legal briefs by lamplight. I know property law, and I know federal land grants." She stopped reading, her finger pausing on a specific paragraph near the bottom of the deed. A slow, dangerous smile crept across her weathered face. "What is it?" Brucey asked, confused by her sudden shift in demeanor. "You thought Jack Montgomery wanted this land just for the cattle pass," Josie murmured, looking up at him. "Brucey, did you ever actually read the addendums on this deed?" "I can read plain English," Brucey grunted defensively. "It says I own the timber and the rock. It also says you possess the exclusive riparian rights to the upper basin of Blackwood Creek," Josie explained, tapping the paper. "Montgomery has been buying up the lower valley ranches for pennies because they keep drying up every summer. He's been damming the creek higher up, starving them out. But legally, you control the water source. If a federal judge saw this, Montgomery wouldn't just lose his cattle route. He'd face a federal indictment for water diversion and extortion." "They will certainly try," Josie replied, wrapping herself in the oversized, bloodied coat and picking up the double-barreled shotgun Rollins had dropped. "But men like Montgomery are bullies, Brucey. And bullies are inherently cowards when faced with someone who holds a bigger stick. Keep the Winchester loaded. I am going to town." It took Josie 3 grueling hours to ride the draft horse down the snow-packed, treacherous trail. She didn't sneak into Blackwood Creek. She rode straight down the center of the muddy thoroughfare, a terrifying vision in a dead man's bloody coat, her silver hair catching the winter sun. She stopped the horse directly in front of the Silver Dollar Saloon. The town was eerily silent. Townsfolk peeked through the frosted windows of the general store, holding their breath. Sheriff Harding pushed through the swinging saloon doors, followed closely by a sharply dressed, ruthless-looking man smoking a cigar, Jack Montgomery himself. Well, Harding sneered, resting his hand on the pearl grip of his Colt. The widow lived. "Where's the beast, ma'am? Bleeding out in the snow?" Josie dismounted with a heavy thud. She walked up the wooden boardwalk, stopping 10 feet from the 2 men. She tossed the blood-soaked shotgun at Montgomery's boots. The initials J.M. were carved into the walnut stock. "Your lapdog dropped this in my kitchen, Mr. Montgomery," Josie said, her voice ringing out clearly in the frigid air, ensuring every hidden townsperson heard her, along with a fair amount of his own skin. Montgomery's eyes narrowed, the cigar clamped tight in his jaw. "You've got a lot of nerve, old woman. Abernathy is dead, isn't he? That land defaults to the county." "I don't know what you're talking about," Montgomery growled, signaling Harding with a nod. Harding drew his weapon halfway from the holster. "Before I left Street, Lewis," Josie continued, her voice rising, completely ignoring the sheriff's gun, I sent a copy of the Abernathy deed to the federal courthouse in Helena, directly to the office of U.S. Marshal William Bill Tilghman. I included a sworn affidavit regarding territorial land grabbing and water rights extortion. The mention of the legendary, real-life Marshal Tilghman, a man known for hanging corrupt barons and cleaning out the toughest territories in the West, made the blood drain from Sheriff Harding's face. He let his gun slip back into its holster. If I am not back in street, Louis, by the 1st of the month, or if Marshal Tilghman receives word of my untimely demise, Josie bluffed with magnificent, ironclad confidence, federal troops will ride into Blackwood Creek. They will seize the pass. They will dismantle your dams, and they will hang you both for federal conspiracy. You are playing a territorial game, Mr. Montgomery. I have brought the federal government to your doorstep. Silence descended on the muddy street. The wind howled through the eaves of the saloon. Montgomery stared at the 60-year-old seamstress, trying to find the crack in her armor, the tremor of a bluff. He found nothing but the cold, hardened steel of a woman who had nothing left to lose. Montgomery spat his cigar into the snow. "You're crazy." "No," Josie said softly. "I am just deeply tired of arrogant men." She turned her back to them, a deeply dangerous move, and walked into the telegraph office next door. She sent a real telegram to the marshals in Helena, officially requesting an envoy to investigate the water diversion. Montgomery and Harding didn't shoot her in the back. The threat of Marshal Tilghman and a federal noose was too great. Within the hour, Montgomery was seen furiously packing his saddlebags and riding east, abandoning his empire before the federal heat arrived. Sheriff Harding quietly removed his tin star, left it on the saloon bar, and vanished into the foothills. 3 days later, the real federal marshals rode into Blackwood Creek to dismantle the dams and restore the water to the valley floor. Brucey was sitting on the porch, his leg heavily bandaged, leaning on a rough-hewn crutch. He watched her ride into the clearing, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had spent the last 3 days terrified he had sent her to her death. Josie dismounted, tied the horse, and walked up the steps. She took off her bonnet, letting her coarse silver hair fall loose. She looked at the giant, scarred man. "The town is quiet," she said simply. "And the river belongs to you again." Brucey dropped his crutch. He didn't care about the pain in his leg. He reached out with both massive hands and gently framed her weathered, beautiful face. The beast of Blackwood Creek pulled the seamstress from Boston into his arms, burying his face in her shoulder, a ragged, breathless sob escaping his chest as the silence of his lonely mountain was finally, permanently broken. Brucey Abernathy and Josephine Caldwell never had a fairy tale wedding. Instead, they built a fortress of mutual respect that blossomed into an unbreakable, quiet love. The beast of Blackwood Creek didn't need saving from his isolation. He needed an equal to stand beside him in the storm. Josephine didn't just tame the mountain man, she claimed the mountain itself, proving that the strongest hearts are often forged in iron.